Welcome to the 2019 KP Chen Memorial Lecture. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event. My special thanks go to those who have traveled great distances to be here. This year, we are honored to have Director Peter Piot from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine as the awardee. I'm Poshio Crow, professor of the International Institute of Epidemiology and Preventive Medicine. I'm going to be the MC for today's event. And now it gives me great honor to introduce Professor Changquan Zhan, the Dean of the College of Public Health, to give us opening remarks for the ceremony.
Professor Piot, Professor Larsen, and distinguished guests, and students and colleagues, it's my great pleasure to have this opportunity to host with the KP Foundations for our third years at 2019's KP Foundations, KP Chen's lectureships. It takes me 2 years to nail down the date, the busy Peter had, but I'm great he made a trip. And later on, I will introduce some of the connections, Taiwan and NTU with this London School of Hygiene and with Peter's. So I will save that before that's the formal lectures. And but with this, I think we will have a very wonderful day today because the weather is good and the election in UK is ended, and then everything is will be fantastic today, and thank you again for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhan, for the wonderful opening remarks. Now let's welcome Dr. Jingchuan Ye, the president of KP Chen Preventive Medicine Foundation, to give us a welcome speech.
Honorable Professor Piot and Professor Larsen, Dr. Zhang Chengqian, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the KP Chen Preventive Medicine Foundation, I extend my warmest welcome to all of you attending the 2019 KP Chen Memorial Lecture. KP is the father of public health in Taiwan. And he initiated the Graduate Institute program 68 years ago, 1951. And he initiated the undergraduate program at NTU in 1968, is it? 1968. And I think most of you, except the foreign guests, are the student of KP Chen. If you are not, you are the students of the KP students. The foundation enable all kinds of public health educational activity since he passed away 41 years ago. We published textbook, Story of Public Health, enable. We support student field study, and we gave scholarship to student research. This memorial lecture is one of the major activities of our KP Chen Foundation. And Dr. Zhang Chengqian will introduce this lectureship later on. And I believe this today will be an enjoyable and fruitful activity. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ye, for the wonderful speech. Next, it is an honor to present you Mr. Andrew Pitton, the Deputy Representative at the British Office in Taipei, to give us the opening address.
Chan Yuan Zhang, Ye Lisha Zhang, Zhuang Zhao Shou, Professor Piot, Peter, Professor Larson, Heidi, 各位贵宾，大家好。我是Andy Pittam， 英国在台办事处副代表。我很高兴来到这里今天。可是我的英文比较好，所以我会说英文。You're very generous, far too generous. I'll continue in English. Thank you very much for the invitation to say a few words today ahead of the KP Chen Memorial Lecture. I'm delighted on behalf of the British office here in Taipei that we have such eminent British expertise coming across to Taiwan in the form of Professor Piot and Professor Larson. Although Peter is Belgian originally, we have adopted him, and he is obviously playing a fantastic role at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, one of our top research institutions. I can't think of anybody more appropriate to be making this lecture, talking about pandemics and the threats we all face. So I'm looking forward to the lecture, and I know you will be too. It's absolutely right that governments also take this seriously and the threat very, very seriously. I was working in the Foreign Office in London when the Ebola outbreak in 2014 happened, as we all saw very quickly what a huge humanitarian crisis we had on our hands, and to a degree a political crisis. And it was interesting for me seeing how essentially a health crisis became a foreign policy crisis very quickly. So it's hugely important that governments prepare for that. And our Department for International Development, we spend 0.7% of our GDP on international development, and one of the significant priorities around that is preparedness for these pandemics, particularly in countries with poorer economic and social conditions who are less prepared to deal with that. And as part of this preparation, I think one of the most useful things is international collaboration and international partnerships. We all need to have access to that expertise and that information, and I'm delighted that we have a great example of British and Taiwanese cooperation and collaboration today. So thank you very much for the invitation today. Thank you very much to Peter and Heidi for traveling from the UK. Very much look forward to the lecture. Thank you. 谢谢.
Thank you, Mr. Pittam, for the very warm address using both languages. So the next, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guests in the order of sitting from your right to the left. The first is Sister Maria Claes. She was born in Belgium and arrived in Taiwan in 1963 at the age of 27, and has devoted her life to helping the Taiwanese people for almost 6 decades. We know that Professor Piot is one of the pioneers who discovered and worked on Ebola virus, which was isolated from a Belgian mission sister who worked in Zaire. Sister Maria Claes is also the awardee of the 10th Medical Contribution Award in Taiwan. It's our great honor to have Sister Maria Claes as our guest in this lecture. Let's welcome her. And to the left is Dr. Ren Xiangzhuang, is the Deputy of Director General of Taiwan Centers for Disease Control. And to the left is Professor Wu Xiuzhang, Supervisor of the Control Yuan. And Mr. Conrad K. Chen, the board member of KP Chen Preventive Medicine Foundation. Let's welcome him. And Mr. Yingyuan Li, the board member of KP Chen Preventive Medicine Foundation. Then the Mr. Jianzhi Chen, the chairman of Kaohsiung Medical University. Due to the time constraint, I'm not able to introduce all the distinguished guests by one. So please join me in expressing our appreciation for all the speakers and guests for this event. So before we formally start, we'd like to take a group photo. So please be seated where you are. And some of the seating area here cannot be taken photos, so please move into the middle rows so that we can have a group photo full of people. So there are some vacant slots. Please, yes, Dr. Huang, can you move inside? So next, may I present you again the chair of the KP Chen Memorial Lecture, Professor Changquan Zhan, to give us a short introduction about this lecture award. Let's welcome Professor Zhan.
Yeah. For a person like Peter's, it's very difficult to introduce the whole careers and achievement. I'm trying my best to let you know that why we chose him as this year's memorial lectures. And I'm Changquan Zhan, College of Public Health, National Taiwan University, and the first self-accredited school in Asia, and still the only one school. University of Hong Kong is only MPH accredited. So, KP Chen was born in Taipei back in 1917, and he graduated from a Japanese university, that's Keio, and awarded Master of Public Health from Minnesota State University. So it's Japanese and US trained. He had done many things, iodines in the salt to prevent goiters, as the most important one is breadfruit diseases investigations, and he promoted national health insurance back in 1961. That's a British system just started, so he's very far-sighted. And he holds many good friends from the world. And he served as a consultant to WHO and also visit as one of the first, it's the first Carter lectures at Harvard School of Public Health. So I think his achievements has been well recognized by the Americans. And he founded the Department of Public Health undergraduate programs back in 1972. I think this program is very unique in the world and very successful. And back in 1976, he already piloted the scheme of Taiwan township-specific cancer mortality map, which Dr. Ye Jinchuan has continued to complete it. I think that's so KP Chen Preventive Medicine Foundation established KP Chen Memorial Lectures in Public Health in memory of his 100th birthday back in 2017. This annual lectures is awarded to a prominent international individual who had made a significant and unique contribution to contemporary public health. So Peter, this is why we think you are overqualified for this, but thank you for schedule your busy time to come here. So my story goes from this important one with London School of Hygiene, Patrick Manson. He was 20-something to come to Taiwan, okay? We have a Taiwanese name, Man Patek, for him. And he was here from 23 to 37, and Peter went to Zaire at the age of 27, right? And his idea of the mosquito transmitted disease was from Kaohsiung when he lived there. And what's the connection? He actually, arrived in Taiwan, stayed several years, and he left because of the conflict between China and Japan, tried to take over Taiwan. So he has to leave, and he went to Amoy, and he went to Hong Kong and established the Hong Kong College of Medicine for Chinese, which later became University of Hong Kong. And he also later founded London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicines. And a very important student from Hong Kong University is Dr. San Yishen. So I always say, if there's no Taiwan, and there will be no ROC, Republic of China, and there will be no London School of Hygiene. So Taiwan is very important, okay? So we followed this, and over the year from 1939 until 2019, we work like London School of Hygiene, and we like to be like London of Hygiene. So Peter, you can name NTU College of Public as London School of Hygiene in the East. Okay. So Professor I met Peter back in 2014 when I attended World Health Summit regional meeting organized by our friends, Fukuhara Dean, that time of this event. And I come across two books. One is AIDS, Between Science and Politics, and No Time to Lose, when I first learned about this. And, then at the KO University, that Peter gave the lectures to students, and including high school students. And he talked about this plastic thermos containing blood from Flemish nuns and sisters in Zaire. And he was very, he's not cautious of handling such a dangerous biospecimen. But it's later on, Ebola virus was co-founded by him and cooperators in NIH and etc. So it's a perfect storm still. Ebola is a perfect storm. So a young virus hunters, age 27, in Africa. This is from his book. And how did virus hunter go? Airplane, helicopters, car, and feet to come up with a figure like that. Global health is a lot of community-based activity. It's not just sit in front of computers. It's impossible. So, it takes an international team to do it. He worked with a lot of cooperators and with his values and years and, patience. And later on, he works on AIDS. It takes also an international team and even an international organization to do that. So he met a lot of world leaders, try to promote how can we stop the epidemic of AIDS. And later on, he is the first director of UNAIDS. That's the first time UN put public health as an important issue. Okay. So he met Clintons and etc. There's Mandela, etc. Right? And he even worked a lot with these community leaders, activists. Yeah, from his book I read, he's a lot of time had to spend time to talk to the activists and sit with them, on the floor. And I think that's public health spirit we have to run. And he get China on board, some of those important people like Wen Jiabao, that's used to be our enemy when he was a prime minister, right? But he went there, and in UN and in different parts of China, and has a wisdom to work with China. That's not easy. So these two books, I have his signatures today, and I will leave in our college for our future generation to know. So that's very important message. No time to lose when we are fighting this big epidemic. And also, public health is about science and politics. Science and politics. I think that's very good. Some quotes, as he was introduced, a clinical biologist, but he is more interested in epidemiology because epidemiology can fulfill his dream. His dream was going to the heart of Africa, Zaire, to explore the outbreak of a new virus. And he did it. And AIDS is one of the disruptive events. And the disruption is not only on health, it's disruption of international relationship and global access to new technology and public health policy. So infectious disease is a disruption. I think that's the lessons in his book. And about politics, politics may well be global, but above all, they are local. One must therefore always analyze national development or advocacy in their historical and cultural context. For example, I think this lesson is very good for Taiwan, how to deal with China. Yeah. If you want to influence an agenda in China, you do not go through civil society or the media, right? You have to dialogue with the Communist Party and various government bodies. I hope our government can learn it because, China is not a democratic society. It's very difficult to work through the civil society to influence them. I think that's, so what the similarity with Peter and KP Chen, they went to the field. So KP Chen, back in 1958, he had led a team, to take this very primitive a boat, bamboo boat, to reach the patients. And Peter, the same, take helicopters, and some of his seniors even have to bribe the local government to have this a truck ready to move them to the site. So, it's take a lot of effort to do this. And they are always with the people. The people, they are not just studying the people. They want to solve the problem. So they are with the people. See, KB Chen with this breakfast disease victims, and Peter with this that time as Ebola affected. So some of similarity, I think, over the years, and they work internationally. KP was with the WHO regional office, serving a very good consultant to solve health problem in other countries, and also those problems related to us. And Peter's, definitely worked with UN, WHO, until several years ago, that another Ebola outbreak, and he's one of the big important persons to be commissioned to do the review of WHO and the reform. That's the current WHO we are inherit. And Taiwan, after the SARS, that we are scared. And I found some report talk about Peter and Taiwan. Back in 2016, he says, Taiwan and Hainan at the risk of a Zika spread. And he has his comments, I think. So I think that Peter cares about Taiwan a lot. And I met him back in 2014 and in Professor Kihara's lab in Kyoto. So we are there, and this is how we are connected. And Peter has another important thing. This is the first biospecimen from Zaire, France's sisters, and we have Ge Yongmian is here, and she is also Flemish, and Peter, you are Flemish, right? That's so that's if I always thought if those nuns and their sisters, they are chosen or by God or chosen by themselves to go to different place, and they probably have different fate and different destiny, but all of them devoted their lifelong to improve health of the local people. That's global health is global and also local. I think that's. I'm glad Ge Yongmin is here, and you have chance to speak Flemish with your countrymen. That's thank you for coming. So thank you for listening, and enjoy Peter and Heidi's talk. And introduction to Heidi will be later than when the second section. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Professor Zhang, for the wonderful introduction. This year, the award is to honor the great achievements and substantial contributions of Professor Peter Piot in public health and global health. May we invite Professor Piot to be on the stage, and Professor Jing Chuan-Ye to present the award. We also like to invite Mr. Conrad K. Chen. Please join us on the stage to take a photo together. We now have the honor to invite Professor Piot to deliver the 2019 KP Chen Memorial Lecture. Let's welcome Professor Piot.
Thank you very much, Professor Chan, dear Chen Chuan, and Professor Chu Chao. Yay. Distinguished guests, dear friends, as Professor Chan said, it has taken a long time before we made it to Taiwan. First time we met, as you could see, in 2014. But I was really determined to come, and I'm really delighted to be here. We already had a wonderful day yesterday with our alumni, and also visiting Taipei. Now, let me see whether I can do. I'm particularly honored and delighted to be honored with one of the great pioneers in public health, Professor K.P. Chen. And when I say pioneers, it's not only for Taiwan, where obviously he made a huge impact, and not only in terms of the impact in global health and public health, but an impact throughout generations, across generations, because of all the, I would say probably children and grandchildren and grandchildren of people who trained by him, because that is also essential. But also the fact that our school and Taiwan, we have some connection, as we just heard from Professor Chan. And the left side, you see Sir Patrick Manson, who my predecessor, who was the first director of the London School. And 120 years ago, we were launched when he came back from Hong Kong. But and this is courtesy of Professor Pao Chung Chen, who did his PhD at our school years ago, and he made this this map showing that frankly at least the prehistory of our school started here, at least in Kaohsiung, and that means that in a sense you're our older sister, and it is that link that we need to make sure that we can continue. Now, I will briefly review where we are with epidemics. A lot of my life has been determined by two viruses, Ebola and HIV, at least my professional life. And but we are in a special year. 100 years ago, the world was in the midst of the largest epidemic of modern times, the so-called Spanish flu, which is a very unfair name. It has nothing to do with Spain. But in epidemics, you always blame others. Particularly when it was venereal diseases, it was always coming from somewhere else. But also here, Spain was the only country in Europe that was not one of the few countries not involved in the war, and so there was no censorship, and they reported quite freely about this epidemic, and hence other countries could blame it on Spain and said it's the Spanish flu. But this Spanish flu killed between 50 and 100 million people at a time when the world population was only 1.5 billion. And it spread like wildfire over the world at a time when there was basically no commercial air travel, which is also quite remarkable. I mean, to come from, it probably originated somewhere in Kansas. That was the first cases in in an army camp, but it helped by troop deployments, it spread all over the world, as you could see, in several waves. And the biggest waves were in 1918, but then a third one about 100 years ago. And also Taiwan was quite affected by it, a bit later than in many other parts of the world. And as you can see here, the first wave was in October 1918, and then exactly 100 years ago, we had a second wave. And it killed about 25,000 people in Taiwan, which was enormous given the size of the population in 100 years ago, which was much, much lower than what it is now, only a few millions. And, and this is what happened country after country after country. And it was not even clear, the virus was not discovered yet, and how it was transmitted, so that was quite a challenge. And here you see that particularly some of the smaller islands could be really devastating, like in a country like Samoa, which is now going through a big measles outbreak. The government of Samoa closed down because there's a measles outbreak because of insufficient vaccination against measles. Well, about 100 years ago, 25%, nearly 25% of the population was killed by influenza. It just illustrates how epidemics can have major impact on society. And if you look at the UK, so 250,000 people were killed in the time of, just after the war. And what's ironic is that this came at the end of World War II, and it killed actually more people than the whole of World War II. And some people, soldiers who had fought in the trenches and all that, who survived, ironically, then afterwards were killed by, let's say, a stupid virus. So that's and that I think in our collective memory is still there. The economic cost was enormous because it was killing young adults in many countries that were already hit by the loss of young adults because of the war effort. So that came in addition. But it led also to an expansion of public investment in health systems, in surveillance, in what we would call now disease control, governments, laboratories, and so on. So with the understanding that governments have a responsibility for public health, which was new in these days. Major expansion of medical research, stimulated by a number of foundations also in the world, particularly when I think of the Rockefeller Foundation in the US. But many children were orphans. So this produced millions and millions of orphans in the world. And there are some behavior change. The fact that, which we also see here, the fact that people are wearing masks, that goes back to the Spanish flu. It did not happen, it did not exist before. And this has become part of culture. And also, this is what I was told, and this in Hong Kong, after the SARS epidemic, the use of two different chopsticks. One to pick the food from the central part, and then one to eat. This, of course, had nothing to do in itself. This is not how SARS was transmitted, But it is becoming part of culture. So you can see in history that epidemics have really an impact on more than just the lives and so on. Now, throughout history, there have always been outbreaks, epidemics of infectious diseases. It's part of life, of the human condition. And when you look here, this is maybe not a very how to say, optimistic view of history, but over the last 100 years, there have been major epidemics that have killed millions of people, mostly caused by some type of influenza, of the influenza virus, which mutates all the time, and that is something that is actually the biggest cause of, outbreaks. However, and I'll say a few words about it, the biggest epidemic of our times is the HIV epidemic, with already close to 35 million deaths now. And just a few words about some types of epidemics, and then what we can do about it, and about the question, are we ready? This is from a report that just came out last month. It's a report by a committee that is supported by the World Bank and the World Health Organization, and it's called the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which was set up after the major West Africa Ebola epidemic, and which was a wake-up call to the international community because of a failure of that community to act early. And just, I won't go into detail, but just to say that at any time in the world, there are usually hundreds of outbreaks, small, and sometimes they can become big. And some are well-known ones, old ones, like with influenza virus, but we also have, or very old ones, like human monkeypox, but then also new viruses emerge, like Zika virus, or Nipah virus, and so on. Again, some illustration, I will give some illustration of that. Now, as I mentioned, after the Spanish flu, the one that is the biggest one, and is actually out of headline news now, is the HIV epidemic, which became from an epidemic, so-called endemic. In other words, there are constantly new cases, people die, people become infected. And we've made major progress in the world all over. When you look at the number of deaths here, since this is starting in 1990, less so the number of deaths went up to around 2 million per year, just from HIV, and that's coming down gradually, thanks to an increase in access to antiretroviral therapy. And the access to these drugs was one of the biggest hurdles, because in 1996, when treatment for HIV became available, thanks to research and industry investing in it, in new drugs, the problem was that the price was far too high. It was about $14,000 per person per year, which was beyond reach for most people in the world. And that, thanks to, well, concerted action of many, many institutions and activists and UNAIDS, we managed to bring the price down, and you see now that about 30 million people are on antiretroviral therapy in the world. These dots are UN targets, and we see that the deaths for 2020, the target will unlikely be met, but we have made good progress. Where we have made less progress is the number of new infections. We had a peak here before the millennium, came down slowly, but we're still at 1.7 million new infections, whereas the UN target was for next year is less than 500,000 new infections, and we clearly will not meet that. And we won't meet it, I think, at the end of HIV without a vaccine, although we can do much better. So that's just a parenthesis, because we tend to forget that with all the headline news for Zika and SARS and Ebola, that we have this continuing HIV epidemic, which has become global and is also affecting Taiwan, of course. A very important milestone was last month in Lyon and Paris, were led by President Macron from France. And you can recognize here Bill Gates. They even took Bono out of the closet here from the U2. And to bring all kinds of people, they raised more than $14 billion for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, malaria. Why is this important? This is important because it provides a mechanism to support not only the fight against HIV, but also tuberculosis and malaria, the three big killers in low-income countries, to deal with that. Without such a fund, a multilateral fund, we would not be able to support countries to control these epidemics, because in general there has been an increase in resources, but it's gone down. So that is actually gives hope for the future. Now, closer to here, as you know, in the beginning of the century, in 2003, there was a new virus popped up. And it's very interesting. When I was in my last year in medical school, was in Ghent in Belgium, and I went for some, what we would call today career counseling. I don't think the term existed these days. And I said I would like to work in infectious diseases and specialize in that. And my professor said, no future in infectious diseases. A boy like you should not go into that, you have to do cancer and cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Of course, these are far more important issues in terms of, numbers, but, and don't we have vaccines, don't we have antibiotics, don't we have hygiene, but being slightly stubborn and also believing that you need to follow your passion in order to excel and to do something well. So I went for infectious diseases, and as you heard, also specialty in microbiology and so on. And and in my young, short career, basically, from a historic perspective, I've seen so many new infectious diseases emerging, and one was SARS. First found in Hong Kong, but it came out of China, and it spread very rapidly all over the world. And that is, of course, a big difference between today and 100 years ago, the Spanish flu. To go from Hong Kong to Toronto, that must have taken a few months by boat and then the train through Canada and what have you. Today, you fly overnight, and that's it. And so that is what happened. So someone flew from Hong Kong to Toronto and caused an epidemic there, and so on. And also here in Taiwan, of course, you were affected by SARS, not as badly as Hong Kong, and coming a bit later. But it is typical for for what is the vulnerability of today's world. And that was a new virus, so-called coronavirus, that now also we know a virus from the same family caused so-called MERS. MERS stands for Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. I don't know who comes up with all these names, but anyway, a virus needs a name just as all of us. MERS started in the Middle East and in the Gulf, and it's related to people who have contact with camels, because it is the virus reservoir are camels. And but what happened again was here a Korean businessman flew from one of the Emirates to Seoul, was ill, went into to seek medical help in a number of places. He did some what we could call medical shopping, because he didn't get a response he wanted in one place, so he went to another medical center, and in each time, because MERS is also transmitted respiratory, and that's the big problem. And you can see here how one person, caused the death of about 53 people and infected many others. And some of it was through while sitting in the waiting room, others while being admitted in intensive care and infecting healthcare workers. But you can see that a well-functioning health system, as Korea has, can actually contribute to the spread of, of viruses and bacteria. We know that also for, antimicrobial resistance of the drug-resistant infections. So hospital hygiene and I would say discipline in prescription are really important. Finally, so we had a respiratory transmitted virus, airborne. We had sexual transmission with HIV. We had further, combination of respiratory infection and nosocomial infection. And then we had, a few years ago, another virus that actually was not very new. It was first isolated in 1947. Where are we? Here in Uganda, actually by the Medical Research Council, UK Medical Research Council unit in Uganda. And, but it was a virus without disease. It was found by coincidence, isolated from a monkey. And, but then suddenly, in 21st in 27, and then in the Pacific, in the South Pacific, and then in a big epidemic in 2015, it caused a major epidemic affecting hundreds of thousands of people. And the problem was that if you're pregnant, if a woman is pregnant, the first trimester, the baby will suffer from severe neurological sequelae, including microcephaly, something that we also know for rubella, but that has basically disappeared thanks to vaccination. It's a similar story. And that is a virus that is transmitted by mosquitoes. And that's also important to know. I mean, we have the so-called Aedes aegypti. This is a type of mosquito that transmits, it's well known, transmitting yellow fever, but chikungunya, dengue, very relevant here also, and Zika. And here climate change is going to be very relevant. Because of the warming up of the planet, this mosquito will spread more and more also up north and south. And so the vulnerability of the world for this kind of epidemics will absolutely increase. Now, a few words about Ebola. You already saw this picture. I must say I was a bit embarrassed by the whole story, but it brought back very interesting memories. So in 1976, and I had just graduated from medical school, really by coincidence, our lab in Antwerp, in Belgium, isolated the Ebola virus. We didn't know. We thought it was something close to Marburg virus. And it was at the US Centers for Disease Control, in the lab of Carl Johnson, that they could demonstrate that this was a new virus, not Marburg virus as we thought, but we weren't sure. And most viruses are spheres or a square and so on, but this looked more like, as you can see, spaghetti or a worm or something like that. So that under the electron microscope, we knew it was something very special. And so this was then the first time that I went to then Zaire, this Professor Muyembe, who saw the first cases and who is now in charge of the fight against Ebola in Democratic Republic of Congo at the moment. This is a rare picture of the Ebola River. Ebola is the name of a river in the epidemic zone. It's a beautiful name for a very deadly virus. And it's, again, viruses need a name, but how do you call a virus? What can you do? The time is gone that you name a virus after a person. That's considered bad taste. Not only that, but these days it's all teamwork anyway. And so either there is a disease associated with it, so like SARS or MERS, or what's also going on is the name of a place. But when it's such a deadly virus, it can be very stigmatizing. This happened with Lassa virus. It's a virus in Nigeria, and it's a place in Nigeria. And if someone comes and say, "Hi, I'm from Lassa," everybody goes back a few steps. It's not good. So we thought, let's do something else, and we picked a river Ebola that was not too far from there. And in these days, we would be protecting ourselves with very simple ways, paper mask and latex gloves and so on, so which was not really ideal. And this is how today, in terms of Ebola, that's far more effective protective gear, but also frightening for people. Now, fortunately, Ebola is a virus that is only transmitted. It's not so easily transmitted. You need very close contact with infected body fluids, either from a patient, that's why family members are at such high risk, also healthcare workers. In West Africa, about 500 healthcare workers were killed by Ebola. At the moment in DRC, about 50 have already died from Ebola. People who care for patients are at the highest risk, plus during funerals, when you prepare the body for burial and you get in touch with the body fluids, because they're full of virus. People vomit, there's blood, there's diarrhea, and there's billions of virus particles. Now, this was in 1976, long time ago, and I certainly moved more to the other virus, to HIV, but now and then there were small outbreaks, and they were all in Central Africa. And so the dogma was this is linked to Central Africa because the virus reservoir is a fruit-eating bat, so that's where it occurs. But everything changed in 2014 when an outbreak was documented in West Africa in 3 countries at the same time. And first of all, the first case was diagnosed, occurred and died on the 23rd of December, 2014. So that is now 15 years. No, that's, what is this, 15? Yeah, okay. This is 5 years ago. No, it was 6 years ago. And, but it took 3 months before the diagnosis was made. For 2 reasons. One, this happened in Guinea, at the border with Liberia and Sierra Leone, 2 countries that came out of protracted and brutal civil war. Reconstruction was going on, and Guinea, decades of corrupt dictatorship, where professionals had left the country, where the infrastructure was really no longer fit, and certainly no public health infrastructure, so difficult to diagnose anything. And secondly, nobody was looking for Ebola in West Africa. You can only find what you're looking for, and if you don't look for the certain thing, then you won't find it. I mean, it's not rocket science. And it was actually at the Institut Pasteur in Dakar, in Senegal, that the diagnosis was made in March, so 3 months, nearly 3 months later. And then it was declared to WHO, but it simmered on for several months until it started to spread in 3 countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. But the international community did not really respond. It was only in August that WHO declared this an international, a public health emergency of international concern. And frankly, it was a complete failure of the international community to deal with this epidemic. And you could see 11,000 people were killed, and in a time that disrupted the economy, society in these countries, with several cases outside. And what it was really was a perfect storm. A perfect storm in a sense of countries that came out of, as I said, of a major instability, armed conflict, rebuilding infrastructure. Professionals had left the country. Liberia, for example, had only 51 physicians registered for a population of about 5 million. And some of them were working in the Ministry of Health and were not really active. So how can you manage an emergency like that? Of course, it's not clear. But also major lack of trust in government, lack of response, lack of means, beliefs about conspiracy and witchcraft and so on. So that's why we had this epidemic at a time when there was no vaccine and no treatment. One major feature was violent community reactions. On the one hand, people didn't know what was going on, particularly in parts of countries that were traditionally, let's say, part of the opposition. They would not believe what the government would say, and so on. So that came in addition to disease control efforts. A silver lining was that for the first time ever, there was some solid research happening, from social science research to testing out vaccines. And the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, we were very involved in doing research, and that was for a vaccine with the Merck vaccine, and for those who are into vaccines, an attenuated vaccine with vesicular stomatitis virus vector vaccine, and that was given to all contacts of someone with Ebola and was shown to be very effective. And I must say that in terms of the involvement of our school, it was really quite interesting in the sense that when we came back from holidays in August 2014, and I saw that these epidemics were getting really out of control with not much response from the international community, I sent an email to all staff of the London School, in these days 1,500 people, and I said, this is a humanitarian emergency. It's our duty as an institution of global health, of public health, to take up our responsibility, and I encourage you to volunteer to go to West Africa. As long as you go through institutions, organizations that have, evacuation plans. We don't have that at all. So that was then Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, Save the Children, and the International Federation of Red Cross Societies, and WHO. And in 48 hours, we had 400 volunteers. It was my proudest moment, because people said, yes, we know why we're here, why we're working. From the IT department, from human resources, of course, epidemiologists, because when you deal with an epidemic, the medical part is actually the easier part. It's communication, it's coordination, it's logistics, something that you find perhaps more in the military than certainly in academics. We are not so good at these things in general. And in the end, of course, only about 40, 50 people went, but that's then the beginning of our collaboration with the countries. In these days, it was not meant to be research. It was purely humanitarian support. And so we did also several trials, and since then we are quite active in there. So out of that came a vaccine, and then last year in August 2018, the DRC declared its 10th Ebola outbreak. 10th Ebola outbreak in the western part of the country, which has been traditionally also really suffering from armed conflict for a few decades, overpopulation, major disease burden, and people suffering in an incredible way, coming out of the Rwanda genocide, of civil war in Congo, and up to now, this was as of last week, about 2,200 people have died. It continues. It's not as fulminant as in West Africa, but it continues, even if it has gone down, and we thought it was kind of nearly over, but now we see, again, like yesterday, there were 10 new cases. And the reason is that is conflict. All disease control activities have been stopped for about a week because 4 Ebola workers were killed, and there is armed conflict. So as long as there's no peace, it'll be very difficult to stop it. Even if today we have now 2 vaccines, one, the Merck vaccine, which is being used for ring vaccination, and another one produced by Johnson & Johnson. And again, our school has done most of the studies to show that it's safe, that it's immunogenic, and it is now being deployed on a large scale in Eastern Congo and also in Rwanda and partly of Uganda. But it's a highly complex situation with, you know, again, conflict zone, humanitarian crisis, community mistrust. Last year, this whole province was not allowed to vote in the presidential elections because of the Ebola outbreak, but maybe also because it was a long-standing center of opposition to the ruling party. And so that was made problems. And it's very close to the border with Uganda and Rwanda, with a lot of cross-border commerce and so on. And at the same time, people are dying from malaria, measles, there's a cholera epidemic, and so on. So everything is coming together. Several Ebola centers have been burned by the community because of this lack of trust. Now, what do all these epidemics, these outbreaks have in common? And that is that they are so-called zoonoses. What's a zoonosis? Is an infection in humans that has at its origin an infection in other animals. We know that influenza comes from various animals, usually you know, birds, poultry, and so on. Can be swine, pigs. Ebola comes from bats. It's from a market in DRC. HIV comes from originally from chimpanzee. And when these viruses jump from one species to another, that's when we get an epidemic. So it will not be possible to eliminate these outbreaks. But what we can do is to prevent that a small outbreak develops into a big epidemic, particularly if when we have a vaccine or control measures. Now, even if in today's world, as we know from the global burden of disease exercise, that people are dying far more from chronic conditions. We have diabetes, we have cardiovascular disease, environmental degradation, and so on. We will always have these epidemics. And because of urbanization, international travel, you know, 10 million air passengers per day, every single day. Climate change, as I mentioned, conflict, poverty continuation, the deforestation, so that the contact with you know, wild animals that may carry some infections could be there. And climate change, by the way, one of the concerns that I have is that the permafrost, you know, in Siberia and so on may thaw, and that could release viruses, microbes that you know, we're not aware of, that or that have been around that we thought were eliminated, like smallpox, population growth, and so on. I'm not a doom thinker, but we need to be mindful of this situation. And when you look at where the protracted epidemics are happening, it's usually associated with societal instability and with conflict. Think of, you know, the largest epidemic of cholera in the world is in Yemen at the moment. We had the Rohingya going from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and with it, huge epidemics. These epidemics pose risk and should be high on the risk registry of countries, and that's the case certainly in the UK. It's in part of the societal risk registry for the government, and this is from the World Economic Forum, which publishes every year a global risk report, and epidemics are in there together with the antimicrobial resistance. There are a huge economic impact. We have the direct costs of medical care and so on, but it's usually the indirect cost can have impact on trade, and the cost of measures. So all this is something that we have to just, it's part of life, and we should make sure we're planning for it. Now, in California, the next big one is a big earthquake, which one day will wipe out even Silicon Valley, you know. In our field, it's when is the next big influenza epidemic going to happen? And nobody knows when, but it will happen when these fundamental mutations happen, so there is a virus circulating, coming from birds or whatever, against which we have absolutely no immunity. And so it could happen, it will happen. And the big difference is that we are today 7.6 billion people on the planet, up from 1.9, so huge mobility, but we have antibiotics. Most people in the Spanish flu outbreak or epidemic died probably from bacterial pneumonia, so that we can treat. But we still don't have a universal flu vaccine. That is really a priority. Now, where are we going? And that's the end then. This is from my favorite painter, René Magritte. He's a surrealistic painter, and you can see for yourself. So what is it? Are we better prepared? The answer is yes and no. After the epidemic in West Africa of Ebola, there was a small epidemic of reviews, panels, reflecting, are we doing better? What is going on? And formulated a number of, of recommendations. The London School, together with the Harvard Institute for Global Health, we were the first ones to come up with 10 recommendations and reforms. And the first one is really strengthening preparedness and public health system in countries. And this is where we've made the least progress, to be honest. And that's particularly in the countries that are most vulnerable. Reform of WHO, engagement not only with governments, communities, business and so on, and better R&D systems. Where are we with it? One is that WHO, I think, is doing a much better job now today than a few years ago in terms of dealing with the outbreak in DRC. So that is a matter of leadership, but also being better organized. Secondly, a number of countries, including the UK, we've established a so-called UK Public Health Rapid Support Team. It's half of it is based in the government, in Public Health England, which is like the Centers for Disease Control here, and half at the London School. So that makes us more flexible, because in the government you have to go through government channels all the time. As an academic institution, we can go directly and apologize afterwards sometimes, when we don't have to, makes it more flexible. And when we were negotiating with the government, the establishment of this team, one of the concerns was, what are these people going to do in between outbreaks? Are we going to pay people for doing nothing, basically? And the answer is that at the moment, there are far more demands than actually, than people and that we can meet. So there is they're constantly out there. They're in DRC, they're at the moment in Bangladesh, and just name it. But that's something that each country must have. And the rationale for it is that in today's world, an epidemic 5,000 miles from you can have an impact on you here. So there is a rationale of being engaged globally. Epidemic Preparedness Index is a bit depressing, so that, in other words, what does it mean? It means that most countries are not that well prepared. When the headline news is over, then, the measures are being put on a second priority. The world has a quite good surveillance system of laboratories for influenza virus, and that is really, I think, where we have made enormous progress till before, because this is means that we can be faster in recognizing when there's an epidemic, where we're not as fast yet is preparing new vaccines. And that brings me to a final point, and that is that in the case of preparing vaccines, developing vaccines for Ebola, Lassa fever, these Nipah, which is found in Southeast Asia, is that there's no market incentive. No company is going to make money with it. So what do we do? And yet we need it. So that's why after, despite the fact that Merck and J&J have invested hundreds of millions in these Ebola vaccines, we cannot expect that they will do that over and over again. That's not going to happen. So I chaired a group of big pharma, from GSK to Merck, to J&J and Takeda, a small biotech, a number of governments, the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation. And we came all together in one, that's now one organization, which is a bit of a complex governance structure of businesses, governments, foundations, and to provide funding to develop vaccines where there's no market incentive. So it's not to develop a universal influenza vaccine, because that's going to be commercially viable. But it is for, Lassa, MERS, Nipah, chikungunya, and so on. Final question is, can we predict where the next epidemic would be? That would be good. It's like for earthquakes. And the answer is we can say which areas in the world are more vulnerable, but that's based on a number of, in this case, this is based on where the potential virus hosts are. But that's all we can do. It's just as for earthquakes. We can know where are the fault lines, but not where are we. And in Taiwan, you are surrounded by countries that are high risk. To conclude, we are better prepared, but we are also in a world that is more vulnerable, it's more mobile. And what is interesting is that some epidemics really have major change, induced major change. And like AIDS really invented global health. When I look at our school, okay, our title is Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but that's because of the past. We are really a school of public health, of global health. We went through the same transformation as you went through. And it's actually AIDS that changed the landscape of making it all far more multisectoral, multidisciplinary. We employ probably as many economists as medically qualified people, mathematicians, molecular biologists, social scientists, political scientists, because that's all what you need to improve health today. And so that's what AIDS brought really, in a sense. It reduced the cost of essential medicines that are still under patent. We had global funding for public health, very big driver of human rights. And this is also where we can always take some opportunity out of a crisis. At the personal level, this is a Yambuku, the hospital lab. This is where I worked in the first Ebola outbreak in '76. For my 65th birthday, Heidi and I went there to have a look. There were not many tourists there, I must say, and in the equatorial forest. And despite the commitments by the international community, by WHO, that we will strengthen health systems, we will do this, we will do that, what had happened? Nothing. And that is really very upsetting. Here you see this man is called Sukato. He was a survivor of Ebola, in charge of the lab, and that's the lab. You can see the equipment he has. So we really need to really make sure that we are serious when we say we should strengthen health systems, we should strengthen public health systems, because that is going to be fundamental to make the world better prepared for epidemics. Thank you very much for listening.
We thank Professor Piot for this wonderful lecture. The following section will be a discussion panel. We'd like to invite Professor Changquan Zhan as the moderator for this session. And we invite Professor Chen Peizhe 庄仁祥、何美香 to be on the stage.
Peter has very concise but very important lectures. Thank you very much. So right now we are until 3 o'clock, right? That we have panel discussions. So can we do this way, going from Peter and have some feedback to Peter, and then we are open for discussion. Okay, so we have first round to have this response. So first from Peter, you can take.
I really enjoyed Peter's lecture covering all these epidemics. You were talking about the Ebola and the AIDS in the Africa, and also then the worldwide. So in Taiwan, I guess if you look from our point of view, actually I think we also experienced some of the outbreak, like the SARS and also several the Zika, etc. However, the question is how like a small country like in Taiwan, how we can join in this world, in this world as a significant partner. That we are like you were coming from the Belgium, right? Even smaller, right? Yes. So yes. So we don't have so much resources. We don't have so much human power, and also especially the politically is unfavorable. So now we can take care. I guess in our CDC can tell you we can take care of our many of the local perennial the infection. But however, the worldwide, what we can join and what we can interconnected with this world web of the infection disease control and the network. I guess you are coming. You probably can give us some idea for the audience and also for us. Okay.
Whatever, yes, I can do that. Originally, as I said, I come from a country with only 11 million people, so it's about the size of London in terms of population. So, but I think that the first duty, of course, is to make sure that is domestic. I mean that the situation is well organized, and that it's me or okay. In the country, because you're vulnerable. It's not because you're an island that will not be affected, and all the travel and so on. So that's the number one. Secondly, I think you have a very solid education system, and training people from other parts of the world, or even from here, I think contributes. And thirdly, and I know there is always the politics, particularly when you come from for Taiwan, just have this bilateral agreements. That's what we also do in the UK with the public health rapid support team, is not only there to intervene or so to help with the epidemics, but also is working with a number of countries in strengthening the local capacity. And I think that that can be done. you have a history of the, epidemic intelligence service and so on with US CDC, and so there must be ways of doing it. But I think, first of all, make sure that you're strong at home, and I think then the region is what I would say.
Just talk. Well, thank you for a very comprehensive review of the important epidemic in the past century. And of course, we can see how diverse this epidemic can be, or pandemic can be. But we looked at, given all these differences of all diseases that might occur, in the long run, I would say, and I think most scientists would agree with me, that flu is one of the most important diseases that impose the most morbidity and mortality, over the years. At least every yearly, on a seasonal basis, it takes some toll, and then there's always impending pandemic of one or the other. But given the current scientific advances that still would not allow us to predict precisely what would be the next strain of virus and what it would be, where it would derive from, where it would emerge, and how severe it would be. So no matter how we prepared, we can never know that whether we are sufficiently prepared or not. So given all this unknown, maybe we can think of a theoretical condition in such a way that given these conditions, then we would be sufficiently confident that we are prepared. What would it be? First of all, just as Dr. Piot said, the universal vaccine. So it's not so far-fetched, actually, nowadays, especially in this year. There's a vaccine that seems to be somewhat effective in stimulating cross-protective antibody in the phase 1 clinical trial. So that is one thing that's important. And that would, if we have that, then we will be very confident that, of course it has to be mass-produced and, popularly used in such a way, then we will be confident this vaccine would cross-protect against all human viruses and all flu virus. And I think it's not that far. Given that everything goes well, probably 7 to 10 years, we will see that. That's direct impact on human health. Second would be looking at the domestic poultries, that if we have good universal vaccine, we would be more willing to use animal vaccines, because in favor of using animal vaccine would be it would reduce in a short run the morbidity and reduce the short run of the epidemic in the poultry, domestic poultry. But the sort of the adverse side would be in the long run, it might impose evolution pressure to accelerate the viral evolution, so that there will be different kind of viruses, would give a much burden for us to track these viruses and to know which one would more likely to cross species and jump to the human being. But if we have universal vaccine, then that's not so much of a problem. And why is the animal important? The use of animal vaccine important? It may not be so important for us, because every time when something occurs, our government will give some sort of supplement to these farmers. But in less affluent countries, the economic toll would immediately impact their health, because that's their limited source of nutrition. So I think we should think of that, and that's in the long run. So, but if everything goes well, that would occur 10 years from now. Now, what will we do in these 10 years? What can we do as a surrogate to know that what's important and where to put our resources are? I would say that a lot of time, what seems to be apparent is usually, it's true, that's apparent, but that's not a full story, because what's lacking is what's vital. What am I saying? Back in the year 2003, in the spring. That was right before SARS epidemic occurred. There was a family of 5 from Hong Kong, went to Fujian province. They returned to Hong Kong, was diagnosed with H5N1 infection, and I think 1 or 2 of them died, 3 of them were infected. So one more question. If they contracted the virus in Fujian, why was there no information in Fujian? Well, no information doesn't mean no diseases. So we should look at globally. I think just now the preparedness index would reflect, these different colors would reflect, where areas with no information. That's where the more developed countries or more affluent places with capability should try to foster, try to empower their capability to conduct surveillance, because in the long run, that would help us as well. And I would say that so far, Taiwan has been doing very well in terms of, we've had a lot of single diseases, a single case imported to Taiwan. We quickly diagnose it. We quickly sort of disclose the information. But we have to be thankful to those international community. The reason why we could quickly diagnose these cases, because the informations are available. And I must commend that China, since 2003 to now, I think in the year 2013, they have H7 and 9. They were so quick in diagnosing the virus. So that really, really makes a difference. And we should really, be grateful in some way, because they are somewhat of a better neighbor now, although they are still not willing to share a lot of viruses and other things. So these are just my comment, and so maybe Dr. Pierre would.
Yeah. Well, my response will be quite short, because I agree with everything you said. And so, first of all, that my biggest worry also is influenza, by far, not Ebola, because it's respiratory, highly contagious, or something new, maybe something like what happened with SARS, but even more contagious. Who knows? That can happen. And so anything that is respiratory and you can catch on a bus, that is the biggest concern. And but even if we would have a universal vaccine, surveillance and typing of viruses will remain very important, because you never know that there is an escape mutant of a major kind that will fool again what we've made. Louis Pasteur, who is the kind of one of the fathers of infectious disease and microbiology, he said in the 19th century, he said the Academy of Sciences in Paris, Messieurs, because there were only men in the academy then, microbes will always have the last word. And in a sense, it is true, because of we all believe in evolution, right? So we have evolutionary pressure. So the microbes will try to find a way around it. So we need to continue that. Now, and as you say, it is really acting early is really important. That's why the title of my book is also No Time to Lose. In epidemics or infectious diseases, if you intervene early, the impact you have is enormous, because these are contagious diseases by definition. So if you can stop it at the beginning, you prevent not only 2 or 3 secondary cases, but then the tertiary and fourth, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why it's so important to have the system that you have here in Taiwan, and that every country should have. But international cooperation is so essential. And this is where a crisis can do some good. I mean, SARS was a wake-up call. China fired the Minister of Health. I mean, they changed a bit of the system. It led also ultimately to openness about HIV, etc. Now it's making sure that the sharing of information, but it is not only between countries, it can be also within countries. I don't know about Taiwan, but in many countries you have silos, and information is, you know, teenagers have access to information through Facebook and it goes very fast. But in bureaucracies, it can take a while. So I don't know here, but that's what my experience also. So we need to work on this information systems, and you know, that requires a different attitude also than an administrative type of attitude, and the rationale is act early. So I think that you've done really a good job and keeping it that way. Even if politically you can say, if you prevent the first case, nobody will know about it. If you have 1,000 cases, it's a frontline news. And so keeping the fire brigade funded in the absence of fires, because that is a challenge that we have in public health.
Okay, so after listening to academics, the perspective, and let's go to the Taiwan CDC.
Okay, thanks for Dr. Piot, wonderful speech for discussing the important disease in the past. And as I know, after the SARS, Taiwan CDC has been working very hard to try to increase our capacity to prepare for the pandemic influenza. And although we are not a member state of WHO, but we are trying to use the guidance from the WHO to prepare our influenza plan. So this year, we found WHO announced a report. They do a survey for the each member state's influenza preparedness. So they announced the result. So the most high score is 46, and the average is about 29, and we got something about 42. But this is our self-evaluation, and I think because we are not the member state, so we some information we cannot get directly from the WHO, and we need to take a lot of effort to get such kind of information from the website or other colleagues. And so I also want to mention one thing is that we use the example in 2013. China discovered the H7N9. I remember it's on March 31, and 3 days. At that day, we catch this information from our media room. We use some Google News search to find this news from the Xinhua News. So after we found this information, and at that day, it's Sunday, so I remember I used H7N9 to the PubMed. It just returned 7 papers. No one human case. Also, it's not a very famous disease in the literature. So I told my director general, say this may be very, very severe disease. So just occur, and it discovered 3 severe cases and 2 days. So at that afternoon, we have a teleconference then to discuss this. We need to have a press release at that night. Then 3 days later, we established the National Command Center, and to set this disease as some kind of our reportable disease in Taiwan, and we also have used the information and to create a PCR test. So, and 20 days later, we got the first one imported case from China. So that's currently we use a lot of technology and try to improve our surveillance system and use such kind of information for the risk assessment and try to evaluate each important message from the other country, especially in China. So currently, I think we have such kind of capacity, but I think we still need to work with other countries together to for such kind of emergency disease. Thank you.
Very good information. Any comment?
No, maybe two comments. One is that it illustrates that vigilance is really important to scan what's going on, particularly in the neighboring countries, because it's likely that that's what will arrive here, but also using the non-traditional methods. I mean, non-traditional from a public health perspective, but a lot of the information in today's world circulates. And I think Heidi will, in her talk, will we'll go over that in more details. And but both are still necessary. Some people will say all we need to do is monitoring social media. That's also not good enough. But only relying on disease surveillance reports is also not good enough. So we need the combination of that. So that's really, I think that's probably out of necessity you have to do that, but I think it's good practice in general.
Okay. Yeah, Peter, you have.
As Peter just mentioned, the control of the infection disease depends on science. This is one very key point. But the other is the politics you just mentioned. But the critical one is actually the social network, social framework. So you see in the country in Africa, they're suffering repeated cycle of the infection, cannot control. But now we have some problem in the well-developed country. This is a problem because for the control of the infection disease, the first one is vaccination, is vaccine. The second is the treatment. So vaccine has been a cornerstone for the infection disease control for maybe 200 years. No, but now this base has become shaky. As you know, there are many vaccine control disease that is started to emerging, like especially the measles. So I think our job appear to be much more difficult, especially in the well-developed country. Now the people make choice. Either they want to take the vaccine or not taking the vaccine. And this may be a very fundamental issue especially in the developed country. So how we will try to grapple with this problem? We have some problem. For example, the vaccination for the hepatitis B virus. This is very good. But a few years, maybe 10 years ago in Europe, especially in France, because there's a suspicion between the vaccine and the autism. So there's a serious, very sharp drop of the infant to take in taking the vaccination. So I just want to asking your point of view, especially the concern, how we deal with this. I believe it's become a very important question worldwide, right?
Thank you. I would like to refer to my wife, to Heidi, in the next will be about that. But I think it's true. I mean, isn't it one of the paradoxes? The 21st century, we've made so many advances, technology, vaccines which have saved millions and millions of lives in history. And now we have measles outbreaks. Many, I don't know about Taiwan, but in UK, young physicians, they cannot recognize a measles case. They've never seen one. And suddenly, whoop, here we go. So, yeah, but I'll like to refer to, Heidi's the specialist, not me.
It will be next sections. But before this, Peter, that ask you a question. You have been working with a lot of great scientists, right? And activists on specific diseases, and also world leaders. So we would like to learn from your wisdoms. How can public health people work in this different kind of background and bond them together to solve the problems? And in general, and in specific in Taiwan, when we are talking about the risk or risk assessment on the pandemic or any kind of newly emerging diseases, there are always one factor, is China factors. Should we be included in the China's framework to think of as a country that what the risk scores should be? Or we actually is a state that we have a big neighbors and the risk we cannot grab because the lack of information and the trust and the free flow of informations. Can you give us some kind of thought under this, what Taiwan government or Taiwan CDC should do when we are preparing this big threat?
Well, first maybe on the general and then more specific. The general is that I think that we are about health of the public, which I prefer to public health. And that means that we must go beyond our own circle of talking to ourselves and using acronyms nobody understands and so on. So communication is really important. You know, at the London School now we offer media training to our faculty, to also students. We start thinking through about what I would call political strategies, how to put something on the agenda. And in order to do that well, you need to think through a lot what are people really thinking, what are people being those who make decisions, but also others, public opinion. You're in a democracy, so you are, you have to see what's in the media, etc. So I think that in academia, and I don't know about Taiwan, but in Europe in general, it's not yet appreciated enough that scientists in whatever domain, that we must really engage with people. Otherwise, we will lose the funding, we will lose credibility, and it's a very, very critical, but it's not by lecturing and thinking, oh, people need more information or they don't understand. We need to, I always think one of my basic principles that came actually from my, one of my, my mentors was Stanley Falco, who was at the University of Washington, where I did some of my PhD work, and then went to Stanford and unfortunately died. And he was a master in bacterial pathogenesis. So how do bacteria, microbes penetrate cells and cause disease? And he said, put yourself in the head of the microbe. And then you can think, you know, what is. And I do the same thing when I try to convince maybe a politician, maybe a businessman or whatever, that they should do something that's in the interest of public health. That's the first part, exercise. And that means when you operate in another country, knowing the history, knowing, I don't know where you found all these quotes by me, but I really try to think through also what makes other people tick, what are their values, what's important for them, and then build your case. But it's also communication and strategy. And so our students, we get a very high marks for student satisfaction, you know, masters and PhD students when they've done. But in more recent years, we had two, let's say, criticisms. One was that They are asking for better training and skills building in communication, and 2, in what they call strategy of politics. And we were not really offering that. And so we've been trying to do that. Now, of course, we are also scientists, so we are not really advocates and activists, but what do we combine? So that's the first thing. In terms of Taiwan, I mean, this is an imminent political question, of course, and not that I want to escape it, but I think you have to see what is feasible. My experience is that in health can offer transgress political barriers. You have something like health diplomacy of health. You can do things that are not possible officially, politically. And I think when it comes to epidemics, preparedness and all that, there is in general, one can have an armistice and you can collaborate, but I'm not privileged enough to use, but that's what I've done in the past. But I think that the issues are going to become bigger and bigger, not only for contagious diseases, but also things like, let's say, diabetes. You know, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where all the big business come together and world leaders and so on from all over. And I had a big wall like this with a map of the world, and I was giving twice a day some kind of, or maybe more like a TED type of talk about how do viruses spread. And you can see moving over the world and so on. And at the end, I ended with a mystery virus, I said spreading. And nobody could guess what it was, but it was diabetes. And it was obesity. And it is also, when you look at it, of course it's not caused by a virus, as far as we know. But yes, but it is the transmission of lifestyles, and here we also, I think we need also international cooperation. And because a lot has to do with food production, with what people are eating. It's easier, so that is going to cross borders as well. So very different, far more complicated than bacteria or viruses or all that, because there we can say, okay, we need surveillance, we need diagnosis, we have a vaccine, or we can treat, and that's it. Here it's very complicated. So there is a real big case for this international cooperation, but I can see, I was, for my sins, for many years I went to the World Health Assembly, so I'm familiar with the Taiwan issue for World Health Assembly. But I guess there is the formal diplomatic one, and then there is the informal, which I hope there is more progress than on the formal side. I guess so. Thank you.
I just want to make a quick comment on the diabetes, because when we read the literature of obesity and diabetes epidemiology, the literature always starts with when a country becomes more affluent, they become more westernized, their diet becomes more Americanized. So it's this American diet becomes really a sort of a negative term. And we can think about that. I think it's in some way very true, also in our country as well. But I would just like to pick up, just now you said, what we need to do, the most important thing is to strengthen our domestic power. So this time to look at what's our weaknesses. So perhaps you can share with us how you harmonize the public health practices between medicine and veterinarian. Because as we know, many of these new diseases are from sort of zoonotic diseases. And we tend to think the veterinarian epidemiologists are quite lacking in our country. veterinarian public health practitioners are quite lacking in our country. And especially more important thing is that we've been always thinking these pathogens are imported, but perhaps these pathogens can be emerged domestically. And if that's the case, what can we do? Clearly we don't do enough, but you can share with us how you harmonize these two sectors.
I don't think any country does enough. I would add to your list also antimicrobial resistance. I mean, the use of antibiotics in husbandry and growing, whatever it is, it's an powerful economic incentive. And I don't have an answer, but I can tell you what we're trying to do in our school. One is that we have now 2 joint master's degrees with the Royal Veterinary College. One is in veterinary epidemiology, and the second one is in global health. In One Health masters. And to be honest, we are still trying to find our way, what to do and how to do it, but half of the classes are in the Royal Veterinary College, half at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and we have more and more colleagues who are a joint affiliation, cross-fertilization. So it's not an answer, but it's a beginning of training a core of people who know how to tackle it, but the veterinary and human health, they in the government depend from different ministries. And that is in itself a challenge. I don't know here, but yeah, and the silos, yeah, but it's a weak point everywhere. There are countries where I know in Denmark, for example, the government and through the public health community convinced the farmers and the Department of Agriculture to reduce in a big way the use of antibiotics in the husbandry. Denmark is a very big agriculture and business, and the big concern, of course, of the farmers was we're going to lose money, and they've introduced it, and the answer is they have not lost anything. So that's I think one of the best examples I know. But we're also trying to bring them together on antimicrobial resistance surveillance. But I think at the government level, we're not there yet. We have to bring it together. But we try to contribute where we can, research and training. Public Health England, the CDC from in England, is also working more and more with the veterinary colleagues, but frankly, to my taste, it's all too slow. It's too slow, and but my hope is the antimicrobial resistance, that will be kind of the trigger, the wake-up call, maybe.
Okay,
You have to always be optimistic. Eh?
Thank you. I was asked to keep the time, and time's up, so I'm sorry we cannot open for floor. But after the sessions, we probably have time to talk to Peters in private and to get some wisdoms and consultation from him. But with this, I think we learned a lot from Peter, from your talk, and from your candidate and explanation of many issues we are encounter to prepare for the next pandemic. So with this, let's give all the panels a applause.
Thank you for Professor Peter Piot and all the discussants for this great session. So now we are going to have a half-hour break of the tea time until 3:30. And so we prepare some fruit and beverage outside of this conference room. And before break, we are going to take a group photo outside. So please remember to take all your belongings with you, and we can go out for a group photo before we come back at 3:30.